For those of you who really needed proof of what's going on in North Carolina, you're going to see an interview with a GOP strategist from North Carolina who's going to admit that this is about restricting African American votes.
With just 55 days until Election Day, MSNBC is launching our Battleground America Tour, taking a closer look at the key battleground states that are going to decide this election. We are in Ohio today, but our tour actually begins in the great state of North Carolina, a state Mitt Romney won in 2012, and then candidate Barack Obama won by a hair in 2008. Today, North Carolina is the site of an ongoing battle over access to the polls. And it's where we find NBC's Chris Jansing, who joins us now from Golan Memorial AME Zion Church in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Chris, my fellow road warrior on the road today, you've been looking into this, right? This issue of ballot access and voter access in North Carolina.
Yeah, and a lot of people thought it was over, actually, Hallie, because you'll remember there was that big federal court ruling that said that the new rule here, the new law here in North Carolina had targeted black voters with almost surgical precision, so they tossed it out. But what a lot of people don't know is it went back to 100 different counties, all those election boards, on those 2 Republicans, 1 Democrat. And while most of them figured it out, the fight still continues in some places like here in Forsyth County, because churches like the Golan Memorial AME Zion, they lost Sunday voting. That means souls to the polls, a time when literally hundreds and thousands of black voters would go together. They would get rides. They would have access to the polls on a day when they didn't have to work. Now that is gone. Well, the Republicans argued all along they were trying to prevent voter fraud, something this federal court rejected. But when I spoke recently to a very prominent GOP operative here, in fact, somebody who worked for Jesse Helms, he says this was never about voter fraud.
No, I think it's political. If you want to get down to what motivated this, the motivation was to make it harder for Democrats to vote, for unregistered Democrats or Democrats without IDs to vote. It wasn't
disproportionately affecting, though, African Americans.
It did disproportionately affect African Americans because most African Americans vote Democratic. I would argue that if the African Americans voted Republican, you wouldn't have a voter ID law.
Pretty shocking admission. And look at the statistics. 70% of black voters in 2012 voted early. So you see how significant this could be, especially in this election where if you look at the aggregate, the average of recent polls here in North Carolina, Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton are separated by less than 1%. And so this very close race here now could indeed turn on some of these changes that are still being looked at. We could know within the next 24 hours or so, Hallie, whether or not some civil rights groups are going to go back to court and fight for people like those here in Forsyth County.
Chris Jansing, keeping an eye on all that for us. Thank you so much from out there in Winston-Salem, North Carolina.
All right, so you heard it for yourself directly out of the mouth of a Republican operative in North Carolina. This has never been about voter fraud. It's always been about the politics, and it's always been about restricting African Americans who predominantly vote Democratic, trying to stop them from voting in order to leverage or fix the election so that the Republicans can win, particularly in the local elections, but more, somewhat in the national election. Okay, and for those of you who really thought there was no hanky-panky going on as far as the county of Forsyth in North Carolina and how they knew exactly what they were doing, here is a clip that shows a person who was actually inside of the meetings when they made the decision not to extend early voting on Sundays.
In the past, they've been able to work through and compromise and come up with plans, early voting plans that best serve the county, and this time, completely different process.
People actually cried.
Yes. Yes, board members were so stressed over the pressure they felt to comply with the party directives versus what they knew and understood about voters in their county and what those voters needed and wanted.
And why is it so important? Well, this race too close to call. If you look at recent polls, less than a half point separates Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, who, as you know, is about to come out. By the way, Hillary Clinton coming back here to North Carolina tomorrow. All right, Chris Jansing.
All right, so that's just further evidence that the party placed pressure on them in order to restrict that Sunday voting, whether it souls to the polls, in order to try to restrict the amount of African Americans participating in their right to vote.